Alright, we might as well kick off. So you're still here, so that's a good thing. Hope you've enjoyed the morning so far. As I alluded to in the panel talk, there's a lot that we can start doing ourselves to start driving this change. You know, culture change is a marathon, not a sprint. So today I'm going to talk about how Agile government begins with each and every one of you. So here a bit of background. Started my career at Victorian Auditor General's Office many years ago as a financial auditor, and today we're building web startups and all sorts of crazy stuff. So worlds apart, but also consulted to the likes of Department of Defense, Department of Justice, while I was with Ernst & Young and KPMG. So understand to a certain degree, maybe not as well as all of you, the inner trappings of government. Also worked for a few other companies you may be well aware of, and I'm a co-founder here at Collective Campus, and we essentially work with large organizations to help them move a little bit more like startups. So why do we need to think about innovation? I think this is something, obviously, we know the answer to this, that's why we're all here. But the next 10 years brings with it great disruption to pretty much everything we know. Looking at the coalescence of so many emerging technologies, whether it's blockchain, which we spoke about this morning, artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things, virtual reality, augmented reality, 3D printing. Cloud computing is obviously just lowered the barriers to entry for so many companies, and we're seeing the coalescence of all of this at the same time, which means that no one industry or sector is really immune to that. And this is all driven by Moore's law, exponential growth. We're at a point now where disruption is happening every few years. The rate of disruption is increasing and increasing. So much so that, and this is obviously a government example, but 50 years ago, the average company lifespan on the S&P 500 was 60 years. Today, it's 11. Tomorrow, in 10 years' time, it's going to be something like 6. This is just because technology is moving so quickly. I mean, who remembers using an iPod Classic on iTunes? Whereas now, we're probably more likely to be using our smartphones and maybe listening to Spotify, or in my case, listening to a lot of podcasts. So the world is changing under our feet. However, oftentimes, and this isn't true in all cases, but government often lacks the know-how how to respond in this fast-moving environment. And it's not to say that we don't have the knowledge, but it is the structure that we operate in, the environment that we operate in, which kind of handcuffs us. And means that we move slower and aren't able to respond quickly enough. 2008 financial crisis showed us that. That a lot of the policies, regulations, and so on were built for a bygone era. I mean, if you look at New York State, their money transmission laws date back to a time, it's the 19th century, when money was moved around by horse and buggy. So it's crazy to think that we've still got the same legislation today when money's moved around by zeros and ones. I mentioned this in the panel talk this morning, that the average spend per year for the VPS, just on IT alone, is 3.02 billion. This was for Victorian government entities. And also mentioned that 70% of government IT projects, not just in Victoria, but globally on average, fail. And this comes back to that outsourcing decision-making, people not wanting to take accountability, and ultimately a culture where we don't embrace experimentation. Small, smart failures, as opposed to big, audacious, bold failures. So, and the VPS spending also doubled from 2004 to 2014, which is interesting because if you look at spending in other sectors, it's going the other way. Whether it's healthcare, education, I mentioned the SpaceX example, I'm talking about that shortly, but the cost per unit is getting lower and lower. Education, we're able to teach people through online platforms like Khan Academy and Coursera. Kids in third world countries, developing economies, nothing more than an internet connection, and now $4 smartphones, which are being made available in countries like India, can get educated. So they're doing much more with less. And these innovations are all coming from the private sector. But imagine what government could do with its vast resources if it operated a little bit more like these private entities. Ultimately, constituents lose out. Like I said, many smaller organizations are driving changes. And so SpaceX, they built a ship called the Dragon, a space shuttle, which cost about 330 times less than the equivalent space shuttle that NASA developed. 330 times less, and actually traveled further in space. And this is not a reflection of it's better technology, but it's the fact that Elon Musk always says, we're prepared to fail. We're going to move quickly. We're going to take short experiments, but with each experiment, we're going to learn, we're going to iterate, and we're going to go forward. Like, he's not afraid to fail publicly. And I think we've got a poster on the wall somewhere. I think it's over there. If things are not failing, you're not innovating. I spoke with the head of innovation at Sportsbet last week. He's got a KPI, a personal KPI, which says that 90% of his experiments should fail. If the number is less than that, then it indicates that they're not trying hard enough or raising the bar high enough. And the only way that you can support failure rates that high is by compartmentalizing the failure. Smart failures, get the most learning with the least expense, least amount of time. And essentially, like I said, it's about government not necessarily transforming itself into a Tesla or an Uber overnight. That's probably not going to serve the community. But just being that little bit more agile, with the wealth of resources that we have, human resources, financial resources, systems, networks, we could do so much more if we were just a little bit more agile. But it's challenging being agile in a government environment. It's kind of like this. We've got processes, systems, values, and whatnot in place, which essentially inhibit that movement. One of the comments earlier was, we've got powerful members of our communities, lobbies and whatnot, which have vested interests, and therefore we're kind of handcuffed and can't, I suppose, go against them. We can't publicly fail. We've got lots of legacy systems that make it slow moving. We've probably got a culture where people don't want to take ownership of something just in case it goes wrong, and we don't want that, so let's call a meeting and make sure everyone's around the table and everyone's across this, so if that something goes wrong, you can just say, oh, you're in that meeting. That's the thing that's slowing us down. And it's hard to break out of. But we can all start to drive change. And ultimately, it comes back to us as individuals. So first thing is about being more self-aware. So a great story on this is a manager who, every time his staff came bearing bad news, he gave them the hairdryer treatment, right? But over time, he stopped hearing bad news. But it wasn't because there was nothing to report, right? It was because of the way he responded to that news. And then over months and months and months, the company deteriorated, and it was too late to make the critical changes that were necessary to save that company because of that lack of self-awareness, because of that ego. And ultimately, this manager was operating from what I like to call, or what Carol Dweck calls, a fixed mindset. So those of you familiar with Carol Dweck's work will know the difference between a fixed mindset and a growth mindset. And a fixed mindset is essentially one where you're operating from a place where you believe that intelligence is fixed. And you're operating from ego, which means that you're not going to go out there and put yourself into difficult situations, conversations, places, people. Someone comes bearing bad news, you're going to take that as a hit to your ego, you're going to blast them, and that will be the end of it. Ultimately, this stops us from learning, from growing, from becoming better at what we do. Better professionals, and also just better people in general. The alternative to that is a growth mindset. One where we believe that intelligence can be developed. And the only way you're going to develop that is by doing the opposite thing. Getting out there, meeting as many people as possible. Different places, reading different things, getting into challenging situations, because what happens on the other side of that is you get better. I mean, a couple of years ago, public speaking wasn't my thing, and it's still not something that I'm 100% comfortable with. But the more you do it, the more comfortable you get. That's just the nature of life. Another thing to call out there, and I mentioned it in the panel, was Socratic thinking. If we think we have all the answers, why are we doing what we're doing? Why is it worthwhile having a conversation? We need to go into situations, especially in this fast-moving environment where the world is moving so quickly. Just admit that, hey, we haven't got all the answers. The only way we're going to get the answers is to get out there and engage with the community, engage with people in our organization, and learn and grow, because everybody can bring unique perspectives to the table. So this comes back to managing people. something else that you can start doing today if you manage people. If someone approaches you from your team with an idea, what happens? Do you ask them, do you find a way to test this idea? Do you shoot it down? Do you put it through the rigmarole of meeting after meeting and nothing ever happens and that employee's morale is just sapped out of them? In fast-moving, progressive organizations, you find a way to experiment. Here, my team, if someone comes to me with an idea, I never say that's a bad idea unless I know for a fact that I've tested it recently under current conditions and the data says it's a bad idea. And I always say, look, if you can find a way to test that effectively, quickly, without spending too much money, go and do it. And come back to me in a week, in 2 weeks, a month, with the results. As long as it doesn't detract from all the other stuff we're working on. And one of the ideas that came out of that was for a kids entrepreneurship program about a year ago, where one of my employees said, hey, we should start running these lean startup or entrepreneurship classes for kids. The world's changing very quickly, yet kids are still learning to become doctors and lawyers and accountants, yet a lot of that stuff is slowly getting automated, and legal services is saturated as is, let alone 10 years' time when AI and blockchain become a much bigger thing in that field. I thought, interesting, how can we test this? So they went off, set up an Eventbrite page with a 2-day course, high-level outline, a few bullet points, little logo they put together in 20 minutes, and within a few weeks we'd sold 15 tickets. And so it was validated. I thought, crap, now I have to put some material together. But that was a way for us to leverage existing platforms. One of the concepts that came up in the talk earlier, let's leverage existing platforms, not reinvent the wheel, put it out there, test it quickly, cheaply. The whole test, the setup probably cost us about 2 hours of time. And now we're running that across the country. We're starting to roll that out in some primary schools. We're even running it in Singapore in November. But I could have very quickly just said, oh no, that's a crap idea. Who's going to pay for that? And also on this point, Richard Branson, when asked, how were you able to build several multi-billion-dollar companies? He says, well, I hire people smarter than me, I give them a mission and exciting work to do, and I get out of the way. By empowering people, you're going to attract good people, you're going to retain them, and you're going to get the very best out of them. If all we ever do is micromanage and tell people that they're wrong and don't let them experiment and try things, you're not going to get anywhere. And on connecting the dots. So Steve Jobs' famous Stanford commencement address said, you can't connect the dots looking forward, you can only connect them looking backwards. So what he meant by this was that you've got to go out there and have broad experiences. Places, people, things, read things you don't normally read, hang out with people you don't normally hang out with. Because by having these disparate ideas in your head, and by coming to places like this, you're going to learn maybe one thing you didn't know previously. And you're going to start applying that to your life. Or you might connect the dots between something you learned today and something you learned listening to a podcast next week. And maybe that can apply to your current role or whatever it is. In Steve Jobs' case, the graphical user interface we all know and love was something he essentially stole on a visit to Xerox's Palo Alto Research Center. And I'm not advocating he stole IP, but that's the fact. The simplicity of Apple's products is a result of his dabbling in Zen Buddhism, and the typeface of the Mac fonts was a result of his dropping into calligraphy classes at Stanford. And he wasn't even an enrolled student, he just dropped in because he was interested. But that's all about broad experiences. If we see the world through a very narrow lens and don't have many interests outside of what our manager tells us we should be working on and going home and watching, I don't know, what's a reality TV show on at the moment, The Voice, or Farmer Wants a Wife, or whatever, then we're going to have a very narrow view of the world. And we're not going to be in a position to really drive that change. Which is where bottom-up innovation is so important. We can't just sit back and wait for people higher up to affect that change or to tell us what to do. There's lots that we could be doing. It doesn't matter which level you're in, whether it's in the private sector, public sector, that you can start to do today to drive innovation. So a few examples that I'm going to run you through now. One is Australia Post. So Australia Post, their IT team, or a few members within their team, weren't happy. They wanted to start driving change. They saw that Australia Post was headed for a $10 billion loss if nothing changed by 2025. And so on their own time, on their own dime, they started running little hackathons, after work, on weekends, where they were working on building little prototypes to solve internal problems or customer-facing solutions. And over time, they started presenting these prototypes back to decision makers. And the decision makers loved these prototypes so much that now they run monthly company-sponsored hackathons. And a couple of the ideas that have come out of these hackathons are now being commercialized. It was a case of show, don't tell, which is much more powerful than just saying, oh, we need to do this, we need to do that. That can also be taken as an attack. And if that person you're presenting this to sees that as an attack, if they're operating from a place of ego, it's not going to go anywhere. Toyota, second biggest car company in the world by way of revenue. The average Toyota employee contributes 100 improvement ideas a year, which totals more than 1 million ideas across the company. Now, granted, many of these ideas are incremental in nature, many aren't new ideas at all, but this comes back to that culture where actively coming up with ideas and trying to change things and experimenting is the status quo. That's critical here. The culture is the foundation to everything. Amazon is another one. So Jeff Bezos basically says, if you swing for the fences, you're going to strike out a lot. But you're also going to hit some home runs. So if all we ever do is bunt to get to first base, then that's the most we can hope for. So Amazon actually run a monthly failure award. Monthly failure award with smart failures, where an experiment was tested to validate or invalidate a key assumption. And you failed, but they learned something. And the kicker is that you only qualify for this award if you ran the experiment without permission. Shell, and I talked about co-design during the panel this morning, how important it is to leverage not just the entire organization, but members of the community. In Shell's case, they've got a platform called Game Changer, where they actively engage customers, suppliers, partners, and the general public to come up with ideas. One such idea that came out of this program was a method that allows them now to produce and cool liquefied natural gas at sea, which one means they can access vastly greater reserves of gas, but also mitigate the risk of an environmental disaster at land. And they needed to go outside the building to tap into this kind of knowledge. And finally, I mentioned the sports bet with the 90% failure rate, so I won't talk about that again. So how do you get buy-in from the top if you're looking to drive that change? I spoke about the Australia Post example, which is all about show, don't tell. Another example in this space is about what I like to call hacking the culture. And a great example of that is Sony. And I'll get to a few government examples shortly, don't worry. Sony, who wanted to run an innovation program. Part of this program required middle managers to give up staff for a week or two. But they were all very reluctant to do so. They thought, I'm not going to give up my best staff for this airy-fairy innovation program. So what they did, they twisted the arm of one middle manager, and he very quickly, very publicly received a letter of commendation from the president of Sony. And this was in Japan, and that kind of thing is a big deal. So he was walking around, shoulders out, chest out, very happy with himself. And very quickly, his peers, the other middle managers, thought, well, I want a letter of commendation from the president too. So before you knew it, they had way more staff being volunteered than they could ask for. So that's essentially hacking the culture. Number two is, and we talked about this earlier, about trying to identify what's the worst possible outcome that someone is willing to accept if they're a senior manager. Let's operate within those boundaries. Ownership. Never underestimate the power of making someone else feel like what you're talking about was their idea. I mean, that's a huge one. yeah, that's just human relations 101. And the last thing I wanted to talk to you about in this space was around compartmentalizing and aligning interests. So for example, Sportsbet, they wanted to, well, their head of innovation joined about 2 years ago, and they wanted to start driving change. And one of the stumbling blocks was IT. And IT said, no, we can't do this, financial systems, HR systems, too much risk. And that was their position. And the position of head of innovation and the innovation team was, no, we want to experiment, we need to do this. But ultimately, it came down to compartmentalizing. The innovation team saying, look, we can do this on a system away from the mothership, like in the cloud, where it's not going to affect any of our existing systems. We can run small experiments. And you know what? You guys who've been thinking about all these different things can also start running your experiments on this system. Win-win. And they basically agreed. And a great case study, not even a case study, a great anecdote here is from a book called Getting to Yes, written by William Uring. And it tells a tale of two students in a library. One wants the window open, he wants some fresh air, and the other wants the window closed because she doesn't want a breeze. And they're arguing, bickering back and forth until the librarian walks up and says, well, why don't we just open the window in the next room, then you can have your fresh air and no breeze. But they're essentially arguing over positions as opposed to their mutual interests. And that's something we do very much in life. We do that quite a lot. And that often comes back to that ego. It's like, no, I want it my way, you want it your way. So, as in Sportsbet's case, find out what those mutual interests are and then try and align them. So, other experiments you can run. People often say, well, we're a big organization, regulated, et cetera, how can we possibly innovate? Medibank, large health insurer, they can only release products to market once a year. Oh, sorry, they need to go through the regulator to release products to market, which is a big, arduous process. They can only change the price of their policies once a year. But they wanted to test this new idea for a product they now call Gym Better, which allows people to access gyms around the country for getting a member, right? How do you test that without putting it to market? Well, quite simply, they went out to Birch Street Mall, places that had a high condensation of gym goers and whatnot, concentration. And essentially, plain clothes, no identifiable logos or names, with iPads, started interviewing people. And not only that, but the important thing, yeah, they actually tried to sell the policy to gym goers. And a number of people actually wanted to sign up. They said, all right, I'll sign up right now, this is awesome. I'm a young professional, I'm always traveling, I can never access gyms on the go. And of course, the product didn't exist, so the guy said, look, sorry, it doesn't exist, but here's some gold class movie tickets, thank you so much for your cooperation. But it was a way for them to test quickly, cheaply, effectively, whether or not people were not only interested, because that's the problem with a lot of focus groups we run. We pay people to be there, they're purely there because they get paid. We ask them if they're interested. It's very easy for them to say yes. But when you're actually getting people to sign up for something and put hard-earned cash on the table, that becomes a much more powerful test. And that's what Medibank did. Another example in this space, this is something that government entities can use quite easily to test market or constituent sort of appetite and consensus. A company called Buffer, they essentially help you tweet across, well, schedule your tweets on Twitter, post one thing on Twitter and automatically it pops up on Facebook, on LinkedIn, etc. So they came out with this product about 4 years ago. But before they did, they wanted to test whether anyone would pay. And so they set up a one-page website, which took them less than 2 hours to develop. One paragraph blurb, overview of what the product did, little green button saying plans and pricing, click on that, little pop-up appears, $5 a month if you want to tweet 10 times a day. And so people click that, another box popped up saying, sorry, we're not quite ready, but leave your email address and we'll let you know when we go. Pretty simple. Does anyone want to guess how many email addresses they collected with this simple website that they put together in 2 hours?
100,000.
100,000? Optimistic.
1,000 a day.
1,000 a day? Yes, but both good answers. 10,000. It made a very short space of time, which for them it was validation. People were willing to pay $5 a month. Not only that, but they could then take this money, these metrics to investors and say, hey, people want this, let's go. But it just gave them the confidence to go out, build the product, knowing that people are ready to buy as opposed to go out, build a product, and then fingers crossed this works. And the final example I'll give you there is of Google and Google Glass. So if I ask you, who's familiar with Google Glass first? A few hands go up, so basically it's like an iPhone for your eyes. How long do you think it would take to build a prototype for Google Glass? Months?
2 hours.
2 hours? I like it. All right, so much closer, 1 day. And they did this using existing resources. So they used coat hanger wire for the bit around your ears, like plexiglass for your eyes. They connected a projector to a laptop, and they would project the image onto the glasses. And ultimately, the test there was, what's this going to look like? What's it going to feel like? Can we give it to customers to start getting some feedback very quickly so we're not building the wrong thing? And that's essentially what it comes back to. It's like, what are you really trying to test here? What's your one metric that matters? And oftentimes you'll find, once you've identified that one metric, you can actually test that quite quickly and cheaply. Regardless of whether it's a big private enterprise solution, a startup, or the public sector. So what else can government do to drive that change? I mentioned collaborating with outsiders. You have a team of 5 complementary skill sets, a team of 5 people with complementary skill sets, a relentless focus on solving problems, and rapid experimentation. They're going to do a lot more than what a company with 1,000 employees is going to do if that company can't make a decision without calling a meeting or calling several meetings and engaging 10 or 20 people. Rapid experimentation is everything. And the thing is, with today's economic and technological climate, where people don't need huge budgets to drive change. We run a podcast here, which 5 years ago would have cost us a ton of money to set up distribution, recording, etc., etc. Now all we need is internet connection, laptop, Skype, and a $40 headset, and it's big all over the world. And we've got people from the UK, the US tuning in. So a small team now is not bound by any barriers in most cases. So Civic Innovation Lab in Los Angeles, they are basically co-design initiative working with LA County, basically coming up with different ways to solve problems that the community identifies. And they do so running short sprints. So 1 week sprints, they bring people together, identify certain problems, map out the key assumption that they're looking to test, build some prototypes, get some people from the community in the room, show them what it is rather than tell them, get them interacting, learn from that. And then basically what happens is you have hundreds of experiments that come out of this, tested, either passed or failed, and then you've got data, which you can then feed up the chain and then maybe build out these ideas slowly but surely. That way, you're essentially supporting the taking of lots of small bets rather than taking a few large bets. 18F, you've probably heard about. They are a government startup in the US, so supported by the federal government over there. Essentially, there's about 30 people in the team working out of a space like this where they're just constantly hacking away. And the beauty of that is that, coming back to what I was talking about in the panel, it's compartmentalized. No one's going to jump up and down if these guys fail. In fact, these guys are losing about $1 million a year. But the learnings that come out of this program are priceless. And if you take, they may fail at a test for $20,000. But the alternative of that is that traditional structures will take an idea and just run with it and invest hundreds of millions of dollars for it to fail. So they're failing much earlier, much cheaper. GE is a great example of that. I mentioned how they learned from their startup. They had to address the culture. Once they did that, they've now decreased the cost to market validation by 80%, which means that they can test 5 times as many ideas in less time, save themselves money, invest where the ideas actually make sense, and just pull the plug on ideas that don't. And I mentioned data, big.gov.au, which is essentially making data sets available to the public to go in, tinker with, come up with different solutions, light touch apps and whatnot, which do serve a purpose. People catching a train, maybe they don't want to wait for 20 minutes because the train timetable says it'll be there at one time. They've created apps that show you exactly where your train is it delayed, etc. That's just one of many examples. think there's health data being made available, education, transport, and so on. So a very powerful tool. It would be good to see more engagement with things like this across government. Open idea contests. I know some departments have run things like this, but internal idea contests is one thing. Opening it up to the public, where the members of the public can come up with ideas, as in a civic innovation lab idea, I think is a great thing. Hackathons. There's two types of hackathons. One where it's all about just getting people together, getting them to build stuff, showing them how quickly they can move, which is good for cultural change, but what's even better is actually going through a structured process where they come out with real solutions to real problems, with some sort of operational model underpinning that, that's been tested and validated, and that they've got enough to work with to spend maybe allocating an extra 10 or 20 grand to this idea to take it to that next stage. So whether you want to drive cultural change or actually come out with new ideas and solutions which are going to help constituents and create more value, that's where we want to go. Incubation and outposts, just like the 18F example in the United States, where we've got these teams operating away from departments, away from agencies, where they have their own policies, procedures, values, systems, they're able to move quickly, they're able to experiment, they're safe to fail. That's a way that we can get these learnings, critical learnings, and then funnel them back into the mothership. Parallel processes. So oftentimes, if we're looking to do something in a large company, in a private sector, in the public sector, rather, there's processes we need to follow. And oftentimes, those processes can slow us down. Example I can speak to at one of the big four accounting firms, we wanted to run a design thinking project for a few of their clients, and we could move like lightning. Overnight, we put together the program, let's go. But they said, well, we need to get the marketing right, and that's got to go through marketing. That's going to take about 2 weeks. Then we need to get all the partners to sign off on this, because it's going to go to all these different clients, and these partners represent them. So it's going to be about 6 to 8 weeks. That, when you're operating at that sort of speed, it's impossible. I mean, one of the other clients of ours took us about 6 months to get the engagement letter through procurement. And if you're operating at that speed, and you've got startups operating at the speed of light, essentially, who do you think is going to win? It doesn't matter how big your organization is, how many resources you have. And of course, the message today isn't about how we win, because we're public sector. But it is about, I suppose, interpreting win and creating more value for the community. That's what we're all about. And if we compare what organizations with smaller budgets and smaller teams are achieving with what we're doing in the public sector, we're doing some wonderful things in the public sector. But I just think if we adopt some of these philosophies and just be a little bit more self-aware, make the changes that we can start to make today, it's going to be all the better. Not just for us, we're going to have a lot more fun at work, we're going to be more impactful, more productive, but also create more value for the community. So on that, I guess the community needs us now more than ever. I mean, the next 10 years do represent a time of massive upheaval and uncertainty, but also a massive opportunity for those of us who choose to seize it. Thank you. Any questions? Yep.
Let's just say you've got a really good idea that you know will save the government department money. And what's a way or a good way of making sure they don't rip you?
Of making sure they don't rip you?
Well, with the IP.
Okay. Well, firstly, I would challenge that. It's a good idea. Well, 96% of startup founders think they have a good idea. And
I understand that. But this is,
yeah. Well, that's a different conversation then around IP. Thing is, is that an idea for government, or is it an idea that you want to own yourself? Because
it's actually a thing I want to do, but I don't want government sort of grab you and then mucking it up and going 1 mile an hour, which will probably happen. And it's happening in the Northern Hemisphere. Australia and New Zealand is happening and not be doing it. I can't believe it.
Well, I guess
it's saving them a fortune of money.
Yeah. Well, that's like I said, culture change is a marathon, not a sprint, and the idea sounds like it's something that would require the engagement of different stakeholders in the organisation, and they need to be along for that journey. But if you can find a way, I suppose, to test this in a... Firstly, you want to test whether it's good.
I'll test it.
Test it? Okay. You've got your metrics?
Well, I mean, I've got people who have actually would have saved, by doing what I'm suggesting, would have saved $100,000 a year in locking a person up. That's the sort of, it's always unlimited beds in penitentiaries, but by doing this, you can clear them out of it, stop them from going to penitentiary.
Yeah. Well, I guess you want to look for evidence of fast movers in government. Advocates.
I'm really cynical.
Yeah, I can see. But you want to look for early adopters in any space, whether it's a new technology that you're trying to grow and there's only a small amount of people that actually embrace that initially. In government, you're going to have early adopters as well. You're going to have people, decision makers, further up the food chain, who want to drive that change, who will try something different. And I think you want to get there, yeah. And also, it comes back to those conversations with people higher up. How can you influence them to see things your way? By making it seem like it's their idea, by understanding what's the worst possible outcome you're willing to accept, and then working within that sort of boundary. And yeah, just compartmentalizing, showing, look, we're just going to run this small thing just to test it, and we'll scale up. I think the moment you engage, like you said, 20 people plus whatever, I'm just making a number up, but it's usually the case, the idea suffers. It's not going to move anywhere quick enough, it's going to become bloated, complex, cost a lot of money, be prone to failure, risk, falling over, cost blowouts, etc., and that's not where you want to go. So I think you want to start building allies in that space.
Absolutely. My final point is the fact that it's getting, when you've got a minister that has to make a decision, and the cabinet and all that sort of stuff, they got the helpers, and the helpers tell them, no. And the helpers, in my opinion, don't know anyone. I mean, it's like yes, minister all over again.
Yeah. Well, I guess it comes back to what you're pitching at. Is it a massive, bold, audacious thing, or are we going to start small and drive that change?
Oh, yeah. Once it starts, it starts. But I mean,
Well,
that just means,
look, it could be the best idea in the world, but you've still got to play the game to get people on board, and by doing that, you want to take small bets, not just say, this is what it is, it's going to cost $100 million, but it's going to generate this.
It costs nothing, but it could generate savings.
Okay, we can talk about that later. Any other questions?
I think just a comment in relation to that, as persistence is really important. So I'm in the process of starting a business and working with local government, and the amount of times I've had no, and if you get a chance to get to the minister, or as you said, build allies, whether it's in the private sector, public sector, and then go to the top or go to the people that can say yes, you have to keep that persistence if it's a great idea.
Well, you know, I just got it up to city council. I know exactly what you're talking about, and I'm ready to get reports. So
Yeah.
fine.
That's a great point. Resilience, persistence. It's hard enough to grow a business in the private sector where you can do whatever you want, move at your own pace. I think if you can drive that change in the public sector, you're basically a warrior. But persistence and resilience, accepting rejection and learning from it, and just keep pushing. Just keep
More
going.
more cynical. So you're right, absolutely right.
Have you ever had problems of scalability? As in the solution works well in the localized experiment you did, but it doesn't actually scale. And because some of these things are localized,
Yeah.
and it might work with a particular audience, and the inference you made from that audience might actually turn out not to be as strong as you thought.
Yeah, which comes back to what Dale was talking about earlier, being a little bit more localized. Because to create a solution that everyone wants, it just doesn't work. And it's the same thing with startups, with private enterprise. You've got to find your niche. If you try and be one thing to everything, the messaging's lost, people don't get it. Just like with the innovation rhetoric of the federal government recently. Some people got it, a lot of people didn't. It wasn't pitched at the right level. But how do you pitch something at a level that everyone can accept and relate to? So being more localized, that's a bit of a cop-out, but at the same time, not every solution is going to be super scalable for everyone. Yeah.
I like all the stuff you're saying about the bottom-up approach. I love to be in an organisation where we have a CEO who's very interested in innovation, but it's a fairly new thing. And I guess part of that is to help you give that legs, give it credibility. And I'm thinking about some of the things you put up. for example, you talked about open ideas contests. Now, for me, that's something you say, oh, we're going to have an innovation journalist on open ideas contest.
Yeah.
Do you have any tips about how to actually make that meaningful and what makes it fun?
Oh yeah, I've seen some really bad ones. Where it's people are like, yeah, we got 1,000 ideas and 99% of them are terrible. Personally, you want to engage people to understand innovation initially, so craft what's the general challenge or theme that we're trying to solve here, what value we're trying to create, because otherwise you're just going to get all manner of ideas. That's one. Number two, if you've got too many ideas, you can't really evaluate them properly or give them the energy that's required. You're probably not going to be able to give constructive feedback to every single idea submitter, and therefore they're going to go grow disgruntled and just see this as theatre and not bother next time. And then it comes down to how you evaluate the ideas. And then you want to look at, well, how can we test it? What's the experiment we can run to evaluate whether this idea works or not? Is it scalable? Going back to that question next, depending on whether or not it needs to be scalable. Yeah, so for me it's not a bad idea if we can test it very quickly, cheaply, and effectively. So that's one way I go about it. And ultimately, I mean, what we do, I'm not going to turn this into a sales pitch, but when we run idea contests, we have an evaluation criteria. We usually funnel, say, 100 ideas down to 20 because most of them aren't really that good. And then you basically run like it could be a 1-day or a 2-day hackathon where these ideas are essentially, we map out what's the problem solving, what's the solution, what's your operating model, any key features, and ultimately, what's the one metric that matters? Let's build a prototype to test that, whether it's getting constituents into the room, members of the general public, whatever the problem we're solving is, determines that, and then get those real metrics, and then base further development on that. Because what I see is a lot of idea contests and also evaluating the ideas. You don't want to have just people from within government evaluating the ideas, especially if they're very high up the food chain and they see the world through a very particular lens. They're going to go with safe ideas. I know there's one program that I'm familiar with, and I won't say who, but I think one of the winning ideas was, let's get Wi-Fi in the office. That is not really the purpose of those programs. I mean, that's a small incremental improvement that's going to benefit people in the office in some way, shape, or form, and that comes back to setting the right objective, engaging the right external participants, having an evaluation criteria, and even on the front end, when people are submitting their ideas, have that criteria up there and say, does it meet this, 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 this? If not, it doesn't. You can't submit it. And when people are voting on ideas, if that's the nature of the system, they again need to evaluate against these metrics. So there's lots of different things that can help funnel what's usually 1,000 ideas down to say 100, so it's more manageable and the quality of those ideas is better. Cool.
Podcasts earlier.
Sorry?
You mentioned podcasts earlier. I'm intrigued by what gets you excited, what new, boundaries or concepts or things that you're out there looking for.
Yeah.
You touched on the open session, and I'm doing an innovation short course at the moment just to kind of open my thinking on this sort of thing. But to hear from you and to imagine what sparks your interest, that would be something to think about.
Sure. I mean, my interest in this space, I run a podcast called Future Squared. It's on iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher. But basically, it's all about corporate innovation. As you can tell, a lot of the examples I gave were corporate, but a lot of the same stuff applies. Big bureaucratic organizations, processes, values, systems, slow decision making, etc. Same methods to get buy-in to innovate. What excites me is I spend a lot of time, one in government, two in the corporate world, and I find it very suffocating when you want to drive change, but you just can't because of these entrenched values and bureaucracies. And ultimately, I thought, well, that's part of the reason why we set up the campus. It was all about how can we empower people in these organizations to take charge, and how can we help people in these organizations to start adopting these philosophies of lean startup. Because ultimately, like I said at the start of the talk, we've got companies out there with 1/100th the budget creating so much more value. And ultimately, who loses out if we've got a government that's just spending $3.5 billion per $3.02 billion per government department, BPS spending is doubling every 10 years, we all lose out. That's not what we want. We want people to benefit. If government's got these resources, we can help them slowly but surely move at the speed of light. We're all going to be much better off for it. So that's what excites me, just empowering people and organizations to do that. Cool. Well, I actually have another talk right after this, so panel 2 talks. I'm feeling pretty tired, but it's all good. If you want, you can email me, steve@collectivecamp.us. If you have any questions or if you want to reach out, feel free to do that. I'm very approachable. If you happen to be in the city, pop in, have a chat, we can have a chat. So, but yeah, thank you so much for turning up. We have Mike Ebenham, one of my fellow panelists, speaking up next on the application of technology in government. So happy to stick around for that. But otherwise, thanks so much.